Our next speaker is Tom Bortnyk. Hopefully I said your last name right, Tom. He is the Vice President and General Counsel at másLabor. He is the nation's leading provider, which másLabor is the nation's leading provider of comprehensive H2A and H2B services. He advises másLabor's clients on regulatory compliance issues and best practices, in addition to overseeing the company's quality assurance program and client service processes. I am very excited to hear from you, Tom, as well as everyone else today. You're going to be talking about a couple hot topics, H2A and COVID. So,
yeah, appreciate the introduction. I really appreciate the invite to speak to everyone today as well. I know we would all probably prefer to be there in person, but sign of the times, I guess, right? Which is an appropriate segue into my topic, which is one, the H2A program, and specifically the H2A program with regard to COVID-19. Apologies to everyone. I know there's nothing more last year than a Zoom presentation on the subject of COVID-19, but hopefully I'm coming at it from a different perspective than something you may have seen in the past, which would be how it relates to the H2A program and some of the unique considerations in light of COVID-19 that as an H2A employer, you really have to think about. So I'm going to cover a lot of different topics, of course, but I think the key, can everyone see that hopefully? I think the key framework that I'm coming at is mainly thinking about things in terms of both current issues, challenges that are facing the program right now, and then some of the future considerations on those same topics. So I'm going to kind of go through some basic issues that are arising and how we're thinking about those things now, and then also how we should be thinking about them as we enter the 2021 season and beyond. So I'm going to enter this with the assumption that everybody has at least a passing familiarity with the H2A program. I'm going to assume that you're either in the program now, you probably know someone who's in the program now, or at least you've thought about it, that you're at least familiar with the basic concept. If you don't fall into any of those categories and you really have no idea what the H2A program is, I thought it'd be appropriate just to have a brief refresher. It is a non-immigrant foreign guest worker program specifically for agriculture. And it's really designed for employers with seasonal agricultural labor needs to be able to fill those needs with foreign workers on a temporary basis. So in order to be eligible for the program, you have to be agricultural in nature, which if you are participating in this event, I'm sure most of you are. And you also have to have a temporary or seasonal labor need for those workers. And there is sort of this labor market test that goes into it, where you also need to be able to demonstrate that you are not able to locate a sufficient number of US workers to take those seasonal jobs. And so there's 3 federal agencies involved, the Department of Labor, the Department of Homeland Security through its sub-agency, US Citizenship and Immigration Services, and then of course the US State Department, which ultimately issues the visa through consulates and embassies in the foreign worker's home country. So just a kind of brief recap of the 2020 season. A lot of things happened. That's a surprise to absolutely nobody, but certainly the H2A program faced unprecedented challenges. So we had travel restrictions, right? We had limiting travel, especially internationally, and limiting the ability of people to get to the United States. We had consular shutdowns. We had consulates and embassies abroad that just stopped processing workers. Scarce flight availability, right? The ability to actually get a flight was a challenge in some cases. We had some countries institute absolute grounding of all air travel. We had lockdowns, we had curfews, we had all these restrictions, right? We had economic turmoil. And mind you, all of these things, this is just the month of March, right? This is not even speaking to the rest of the year. Just for some, from our perspective, we are, one of the leading agents in the country. We do a lot of H2A business. There was a lot of alarm, especially in late March, about the viability of the H2A program in this type of environment. Within the span of 3 days, almost all of Central America went offline. There was a COVID infection at the Jamaican embassy, and shortly thereafter, we started to see sort of the domino effect of consulates and embassies all over the world shutting down. And it was actually due to a sort of last-minute intervention on the part of then Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue to keep Mexico open. If you're familiar with the H2A program, you likely know that somewhere in the range of 90% of H2A workers are coming from Mexico. So it's all the more critical that Mexico stay open, because otherwise you really don't have a functional H2A program. And ultimately, Mexico did stay open. The consulate, especially in Monterrey, Mexico, did a phenomenal job keeping things functional, keeping things moving, and making it to where workers could successfully get visas and get to the United States. But we certainly, we faced a lot of uncertainty, especially in those early months. President Trump closed the border, and we had to wait for clarifying guidance that said that work-related travel, like H2A workers, were exempt from that. So point is, a lot of things were happening in 2020 that sort of threatened the viability of the program. But if you want an optimist take, the program survived. And not only did it survive, I think it's probably at a pretty strong point right now, because in light of all these challenges, right, there was sort of an acknowledgement that the program is essential to American agriculture. And if it's essential to American agriculture, it's sort of essential to the U.S. food supply and U.S. national interests. So that recognition that H2A plays a part in U.S. critical infrastructure, I think that's a really strong, it sort of lends credence to everything that everybody who has been a part of these programs or a stakeholder, it's something that they've been saying for years. And it's something that there are opponents in the government, on the political spectrum that are opposed to these programs. Even they had to acknowledge its importance. So if you want to walk away with sort of a bottom line conclusion for 2020, it's that the program is strong, the program is viable, and it continues to function even in light of these challenges. So I think we can expect the 2021 season to go relatively smoothly, all things considered. So just to recap some of the things that the government did in response to the crisis, separate and apart from the negative things, lockdowns and things like that, there were some good things that came out of it, namely in the form of what I'm going to call a little bit of regulatory loosening, some flexibility that came out of the government. The Department of Labor, which is obviously sort of the first step in the process, they promulgated some emergency guidance that offered some flexibility. So the ability to add housing units. Typically, that's not something that can be done after you get your labor certification, but they sort of recognize the need to have additional housing just to create social distancing between workers. And other things like job duties or work sites, things that ordinarily you're not allowed to do, that they recognized was, it's really important that employers have that kind of flexibility to be able to adapt. And then there's some procedural tools as well that have always been discretionary on the part of DOL, the ability to terminate a contract mid-season without further penalty, the ability to shorten the filing timeline or extend the visa period. Those are all things that typically you have to show good cause, and they came out right on the front end and said that if you have a COVID-related reason, that's generally good enough. So there's definitely some flexibility there. We also saw some flexibility out of Homeland Security. For at least a short period, they waived the 3-year limit on workers' stay. Obviously, you as an employer, it has to be a temporary need of no more than 10 months is the DOL standard. But individual workers can remain in the U.S. transferring from contract to contract. So they can finish their 10 months with you and they can jump and get on another H2A contract for up to 3 years under usual rules. They temporarily suspended that primarily because of all the travel restrictions. They wanted to make sure that if workers were already in the U.S., that there was not major obstacles towards them staying in the US and being able to work in the off chance that other workers who are not in the US weren't able to get into the country. And that was something that the government put a lot of thought into, as far as making sure that there was a supply of workers available to meet any amount of demand. And then again, I mentioned consular availability. Obviously, Mexico did stay open, and the other countries remained offline for some period of time, but eventually they did reopen as well under limited, socially distant circumstances. And right now they're doing as many they're doing as many consular appointments as they can, and minimizing the need for consular interviews. So things are going smoothly. We're not seeing any major problems on that front. So when we think about current challenges, I don't think I need to tell anybody about the need for workplace safety. And this is not just sort of the practical considerations as an employer, the responsibility that you have towards your employees, but some of it is government mandated. Some of it is directly in response to workplace safety rules that state or local governments put out there. And certainly that's true in key states like Washington. Washington was one of the first to come out with significant rules, particularly for worker housing. That was one of the early adopters of rules that govern exactly what you can do with worker housing. Bunk beds were a very controversial issue. And ultimately, what I think Washington ended up doing was sort of this group shelter model, where if you have a large contingent of workers who live and work together, if you group them into groups of 15 and have those workers stick together, you can really minimize your risk, because if there is a potential infection, it's not gonna hit all 500 of your workers. It might only hit that group, and so you at least limit your exposure. Whether or not that's a mandatory practice, even in states where that isn't a mandatory practice, we've seen employers adopt that model, just because it is sort of a risk mitigation tool. PPE, obviously, in addition to face coverings, there's all sorts of requirements that states are promulgating as far as what you need to provide workers, whether that's latex gloves, whether that's face shields. There's also sanitation protocols. You have to give cleaning equipment, disinfectants, conduct routine disinfection of common areas. There's a lot of current challenges on that front. When we think about things in the future, right? We sort of don't know where the pandemic is going to go, and we certainly don't know where things are going to go from a public policy perspective. I'd like to think that we're sort of on the tail end of this thing, that if we get widespread vaccination rollout and all these other things, that maybe there won't be more stringent requirements. But if you're an employer who's doing a risk assessment, I think you have to sort of prepare for the worst, right? And so in light of that, I think it's helpful to think about what other states have started requiring, and sort of, paying attention to what's going on in a neighboring state to figure out if you may need to make similar accommodations. So while bunk beds might be allowed in Washington right now, Oregon, California, they've banned bunk beds. So if you're a Washington employer who's currently relying on bunk beds, what are you going to do to increase that housing availability? Do you have plans? Do you know people who might have spare housing? Are you prepared to reduce your workforce if you can't find adequate housing? There's a lot of things to think about on that front. Isolation and treatment. Seems like every day there's a new governor's order or locality that's putting forth an order. What are you going to do to make sure that workers are taken care of in isolation? I know Washington came out early and said, look, you need to isolate people. You need to provide water, drinking water, and food and medical supplies. The latest one requires visits from a healthcare professional. So how are you going to arrange that? Thinking about this, you sort of wonder if it wouldn't be advisable to start thinking about getting together in groups with some of your peers, neighboring farms, neighboring operations, and seeing if you might group together and have a dedicated resource that can service all those farms and sort of be on call if needed. That's one solution. talking to nonprofit organizations, talking to policymakers in your state to see if there might be some public options to that, whether in the form of direct services or in the form of grant money. But it's something to think about as you contemplate these potential expenses. Retrofitting, a big subject of debate with the Washington state rules and the Oregon rules as well, was this idea of retrofitting housing, retrofitting vehicles even, with physical barriers to keep people safe. I'm sure all of us wish we had invested in the plexiglass industry back in 2019, but that's an industry that's probably doing pretty well right now due to all the investments that people are making. Are there going to be any new requirements? What sort of retrofitting might come about as a result of a state requirement? That's something to think about too. Is what sort of physical items can you place in your housing or on your work site or wherever that will help keep workers safe and meet those compliance standards? Testing is also a big challenge in the context of H2A, because inherently you're talking about not only workers that are coming from out of state, but out of the country. And I will tell you that some states have already imposed mandatory testing on even U.S. citizens that are traveling. New York, for example, has made it a requirement that anybody who comes into the state has to show a negative test result. Is that going to happen for H2A workers coming out of country? Yeah, I mean, I think it's realistic to expect that. So that's one thing you have to think about. In fact, the CDC just issued an order. I'm sure everybody at least heard about it. On the 26th, all air travelers entering the United States are going to have to show a negative test result 3 days prior to boarding the plane. They won't let you board the plane unless you can show that negative test result. So if you think about countries that are primary source countries for H2A workers, many of them do rely on air travel. You can't take a bus from Jamaica, you can't take a bus from Guatemala, you have to fly. And that means you have to locate and source reliable lab tests in those countries for your workers before they're even able to get here. And that's certainly a challenge. Just on a related note, that requirement has been in place in those countries for a long time. I would say at least 6 months. Those countries have required a negative test result to come from the US. So one of the challenges we face this past season was workers getting stranded. We had a number of employers who, they had Peruvian workers who were stranded in the US and could not go home because of the testing requirement and because of just complete lack of flight availability. So that's definitely a challenge. If we think about this in terms of what's next, what are you going to do if your state imposes a testing requirement? Are you going to be prepared to locate a lab in Mexico, right? Are you prepared to pay for that test? Are you prepared to organize all these logistics that are associated with that? That's one thing to think about. And certainly, as I mentioned, how are you going to get the workers home if there's a testing requirement in those countries? You have to be able to have testing here in the US before they leave. The CDC requirement is interesting because it only applies to air travel, which, if you want to think about things in terms of a lawyerly loophole, I guess you could cross by land if you're coming from Mexico, cross into Laredo and hop on a domestic flight and circumvent that requirement. But then it begs the question, how long is the land border going to be exempt from this? There's buses coming across the border every day. Are they going to start requiring tests? Perhaps under a Biden administration. We really don't know. So if you think about things in terms of testing requirements, if the visa issuance process in Mexico is a 3-day process and you need to show testing within 3 days of travel, it starts to seem like you need to locate testing resources in the city where the workers actually receive their visas. So there can be major logistical challenges with doing that, particularly if everyone else is trying to do the exact same thing. Just on an anecdotal note, we've been in contact with the CDC on this very question, and we're actually coordinating with them to try to identify ways of getting workers tested as a service to them, and also to mitigate against some of the uncertainty if such a requirement were to become mandatory. Self-isolation, and this sort of goes hand in hand with testing. There are states that definitely require people coming in from out of state or out of country to self-isolate for 2 weeks. And that's in addition to isolation of workers who are actually sick, of course. But if you think about mandatory quarantine periods, that can be disruptive. If you need workers to start on a certain date and they have to spend 2 weeks in quarantine, what effect is that going to have on your business? So you may want to think about that as you're planning your season, potentially plan for some amount of time which they're not going to be able to work. And certainly there are sick leave requirements as well. Obviously the FFCRA federal rule, that provision expired. It's now completely voluntary. But there are state sick leave policies as well. Oregon has one, Washington has one. So that's something to think about as well. On the issue of travel, right? If it does impose a quarantine, you should really ask yourself, what does the rule actually require, right? When it says quarantine, does that mean they're not allowed to go out in public? Does that mean that they have to stay on the farm? And if so, does that mean that they can't work? One of the challenges is really reading the fine print of some of these orders to try to figure out if it actually precluded work activities from taking place. In many cases, they didn't. And so, we sort of took the position that workers, if you have them quarantined in the worker housing, in large groups, that's probably more dangerous than if they're out in the field, right? So just something to think about. Right now, there is no mandatory quarantine for Idaho, Oregon, or Washington. I will note that there is a sort of recent order for Washington that only applies to travelers from the UK and South Africa, who obviously have the new strain of COVID that is running rampant through those countries. Everyone else, it's merely encouraged to self-quarantine. Now, if we think about the future, what does this actually mean? One, I would just remind everyone, you can't force workers to stay in the housing, right? You can't put a gun to their head and lock them in. They have freedom of movement. You are not the police, right? You're not deputized by the governor to enforce these self-isolation quarantine practices. The only thing you can do as the employer is enforce your own work rules and enforce access to your own workplace, right? So you can create economic incentives for the workers to comply. In other words, you're not allowed to work until you complete your mandatory 2 weeks. And if you break quarantine, you reset the clock on that, right? That's probably a pretty good incentive for most workers. Like I said, read the fine print, figure out what the exact requirements are and comply with it. Don't speculate. Don't read the media reports of, summarizing what the rule is. Read the rule and figure out what it actually says. Keep in mind that if workers are in quarantine, you're going to need to figure out how to make provisions for keeping them fed, giving them the basic necessities, right? If they're not going to be working, they're not going to be earning an income. They may not be able to pay for any of that. Especially, a lot of these workers are coming from very rural parts of Mexico. They got the shirt on their back and that's about it. And they're not going to have anything until they get that first paycheck. So you might consider payroll advances. You might consider loans to help them get through that period. You could also consider early reimbursement of their travel expenses, right? You are on the hook for those costs. You don't have to reimburse it until halfway through the contract. But if you choose to reimburse them early, that at least gives them some pocket money and they can buy groceries or whatever it is they need to do. And then it's sort of an open question how the Biden administration is going to handle this. Are they going to impose mandatory sick leave provisions, reinstate the FFCRA? Are there going to be nationwide quarantines for travelers that are moving between states or between countries? We sort of don't know how that plays out. I guess it sort of remains to be seen. Now, another challenge, of course, is vaccination. And this is something that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds. When is the vaccine going to be available? Who's it going to be available to? And when is it going to be effective? And so I did pull the timelines for a couple key states that are important to this this event. In general, ag workers are considered essential workers. Different states call them different things. You know, critical workers, essential workers, frontline workers, take your pick. And so there is definitely a recognition that they play a key role in the functioning of the economy and the functioning of the food supply. So they are going to be, you know, pretty high up on the priority list, right after doctors and nurses and that sort of thing. So I think in terms of a timeline, we can expect vaccine availability sometime in the spring, which happens to coincide with the start date for many employers. Certainly spring is sort of the peak H2A crossing time. But certainly if you are thinking about bringing in workers for the hop harvest, right, you may have a better shot at vaccine availability by the time those workers need to cross. So something to think about. And certainly if workers fit into one of the other higher priority categories, you know, by virtue of age or health condition, they may have access to it earlier. Now's the tricky part, right? Because right after everybody asks about vaccine availability, the next question is, can I make them get it, right? That's something that we hear all the time. Pretty much every conversation I've had about the vaccine has had that question buried in it. Is what can I do as an H2A employer? Can I make the workers get the vaccine? And the answer is yes, with some important caveats, right? It sort of depends. The EEOC did issue guidance in December of last year that stressed that this pandemic is sort of an essential situation, it's a critical situation, and that there are sort of workplace related reasons why you would want to mandate vaccines. And so if it's essential to the functioning of your business, which in the case of ag workers is probably the case, it's a high risk group, it's an essential group, that you can mandate it. Couple considerations there. One would be the Americans with Disabilities Act. Certainly if they have an underlying health condition that precludes them from getting the vaccine, right, an allergy or something like that, the question you have to ask is, would they pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others as a result of not being vaccinated? So I guess a better way to look at this, if you have 100 workers, right, and only one of them is objecting to the vaccine for health related reasons, it's probably pretty reasonable to exempt that person from the requirement. And the exemption would be on the basis that if they're the only ones not getting the vaccine, you know, that's not really a direct threat to others because everybody else is getting it, right? So it's a question of, is there a direct threat, and can you eliminate that direct threat through a reasonable accommodation? And if the answer is no, you know, that's sort of a basis to change your policy on that. So you got to consider the Americans with Disabilities Act. You got to consider the implications of that. The other requirement would be a religious objection. And so if you think about this in terms of Title VII, Civil Rights Act, if there is a legitimate bona fide religious belief, religious practice that is against vaccines, it becomes an analysis on whether you can make a reasonable accommodation. And generally the test for whether it's a reasonable accommodation is whether there's undue hardship, right? So is it going to cost you more than just some nominal burden to accommodate that worker? And so those are all things you need to be thinking about. The other thing to keep in mind from an H2A perspective that is unique to H2A is the need to disclose such a requirement on the front end. So it's sort of a cliche at this point that if you're in the H2A program, everything has to be documented, everything, to an almost obnoxious degree. You have to document things. And that includes filing a job order with every single material term and condition of employment. That's just a basic requirement of the program. You have to disclose it, you have to advertise it, you have to give it to the workers in written form. If you are intending to impose that sort of requirement, it has to be in your job order. You have to know about it in advance and plan for it and disclose it to workers on the front end. Nobody should be surprised by it. If they're surprised by it, It means that you haven't done your diligence as far as the H2A program is concerned. So definitely keep that in mind. Can the government require it? You know, I'm not going to get into the constitutional questions as far as whether the government can require it for US citizens. That's a separate issue. But in the context of H2A workers, the answer is yeah, they probably can. And in fact, the CDC has broad authority to make recommendations on who should be vaccinated and in what circumstances. And I will just tell you that right now, at least for immigrant visa applicants, the CDC does require vaccinations of very common illnesses like measles, mumps, rubella. That's something that the CDC currently requires. So would they require a COVID vaccine for immigrant visas? Yeah, it seems plausible, right? Could they require it for non-immigrant visas? Yeah, I think they have the authority to do that. And I think that if there was a compelling public policy reason for doing that, I think that that's something that they might consider. To our knowledge, you know, I haven't heard anything from the Biden administration on that question, but it's certainly an interesting one. And I think, you know, people should be prepared for that. If we want to think about things in terms of the bottom line, you know, there's a lot to think about. At this point, everyone's a COVID professional, right? So you all probably have your best practices in place. You know, nothing's a surprise at this point, and we're just going to kind of press forward. So even though we enter 2021 with a lot of uncertainty, just know that COVID did not stop the H2A program's momentum. It kept growing. People kept using it. There was some disruption, to be sure, but ultimately everybody got the workers they needed. You know, we didn't have mass labor shortages as a result of an H2A shutdown. The food supply was kept intact. And so I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic that as we turn the corner on the pandemic, that it's starting to look like a pretty viable season. There is sort of a question about the political situation, right? That President Biden enters office with complete control of Congress for the Democrats. And so we don't really know what that looks like from a policy perspective. We do know that Biden sort of campaigned on the idea of tackling the pandemic in a more systemic way than the previous administration. So I think it would be reasonable to expect more lockdowns or more restrictions or more aggressive measures put in place. The only thing I'll say is that, you know, at least in the Pacific Northwest, things are already pretty stringent, right? At least from a national perspective, the states that many of you are located in have been pretty aggressive about it already. So I sort of don't think that you all have anything to worry about, because it's very unlikely that there would be any national mandate that rises to that level. And if anything, you know, the national mandate might mirror what you guys are already doing. So probably not anything to worry about on that front, but certainly keep an eye on. And sort of on a final unrelated note, there's a lot going on in the world of H2A. Things are not static. Things are moving. Things are happening. There was sort of a last-ditch effort by the Trump administration to reform the program. We saw a new wage rule. We saw a new set of program regulations that got proposed right in the final few days of the Trump administration. And ultimately, all those efforts have been stymied, either by litigation or by the incoming Biden administration pulling the plug. You know, the final rule that just came out of the Trump administration, here we are in day one of the Biden administration, and they've already axed it, and it's under further review. I guess the point is, keep an eye on the H2A world, because things are changing. We can expect, even if it's not going to be the Trump administration's proposed rulemaking, I think we can expect the Biden administration to take up a lot of those provisions and to start thinking about how to change the program. So it's a very fluid situation. It's not something that, you know, the H2A regulations that are governing the program now have been in place since 2010. And so we're sort of now in the longest period where there hasn't been a major regulatory reform effort. So we're sort of long overdue for one. And whether that'll be something that comes out of Congress, whether that's something that comes out of the administrative agencies, yet to be determined. But it's definitely an interesting time to be in the program. And certainly if you're thinking about getting into the H2A program, just make sure that you're sort of fully aware, that these things are on your radar, that you're thinking about them, because it can affect the way that you approach the program. And this is not a plug for másLabor or anything, but definitely hire competent professionals to help you, whether that's Moss or whether that's a local attorney or whether that's a local, agent. Make sure that you have help and someone to advise you on all these issues, because there's a lot to keep up with. It's not very straightforward, and having a professional can help you keep track of all these various things that are going to be thrown at you, because it's certainly too much for any one individual to do on their own. And I did want to, take any questions that anyone had, either in the a Q&A session here, or if you wanted to just email me directly, I'm certainly happy to do that.
We had one, Tom, and it comes from Ben. And he asked, will workers have to bring something in that says they have gotten the vaccine? Do you get some form of documentation that you have gotten the vaccine?
So it's my understanding that currently you do get a card of sort once you get your second dose. So both of the vaccines that are currently FDA approved and in use right now, both of them are dual shot vaccines, which means you get your first shot, then you wait a couple weeks, and then you get a second shot. Once you get that second shot, you do get a card that says that you're vaccinated. I guess it sort of depends. Right now, there is no mandatory vaccine requirement for any of the H2A workers. That's something that could conceivably be done. And I think that if they did require that, I think that card would probably suffice, unless they move forward with the idea of a COVID vaccine passport, which is something that I think there's a consortium of tech companies, Google and Amazon and all these other sort of high profile tech companies, have been working on the idea of a passport that is sort of an authenticated way of verifying that you have received the vaccine and making that mandatory for access to public places and things like that. That would be sort of the extreme end of it. But yeah, I think in terms of current requirements, there is no current requirement, but they do give you a card.
And then I had a question, Tom. So listening to you, we do use the H2A program. Mm-hmm. I do feel like your message overall seemed fairly positive. I mean, COVID is definitely present and something that I think farms have actually done a really great job learning how to deal with it and to work through it. Looking forward into this year, do you feel pretty positive, like things are looking on time, and just from what your feedback that you have, within Moss and kind of your peers, is it going to be a positive thing? Are people still coming kind of as planned, particularly from Mexico? It seemed like it, but I just was kind of trying to get the vibe a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's reason to be optimistic. I mean, we've definitely sort of gone through the worst of it and came out the other side intact, right? That like I said, there was a time when we weren't even sure if this was going to be a functional program. It wasn't clear if workers were going to be able to cross the border. It wasn't clear, even if they could cross the border, if they could get a visa to do it. It wasn't clear that buses would be able to be available. There was sort of a lot of unknowns. Even if we think back to some of the actions that the Trump administration made, I mean, there was a complete freeze on immigration, and certain other visa programs were effectively shut down. And so H2A sort of flew under the radar, perhaps, but I think there was a recognition from at least, key decision makers within the Trump administration that sort of recognized the importance that H2A plays. And Sonny Perdue was probably chief among them. Secretary Perdue was a serious champion of the program. So if we can get through that, if we can get through those challenges, I tend to see 2021 as looking fairly bright. I think the bigger challenge going forward is not going to be COVID necessarily. it's going to be a new administration that has a lot of uncertainty as far as their policy objectives and whether they ultimately prove to be pro-employer or more pro-worker. Because they're, like I said, we are on the cusp of something happening on the regulatory front, and it's a question of what that's going to look like. And so certainly if the Democrats have a majority in Congress and they have the White House, I'm not trying to generalize, but Democratic administrations tend to be more on the pro-worker side of things. And so we might see more stringent enforcement of program abuse. We might see wage rates go up and new wage requirements put into place. So we might see some things that are not exactly pro-employer with the H2A program. But overall, I think it will continue to be completely viable going forward. And certainly COVID has not stalled its momentum. It has continued to grow sort of on target with prior years.
Awesome. We have one more question, it looks like, from Ben again. Do you foresee some of the restriction being reduced anytime in the future with the increase of vaccines?
Certainly, yeah, I think that's likely. I think there's probably, it's sort of in correlation with one another, that as you see vaccination become more widespread, I think you will see a loosening of some of these requirements. You know, people have been making projections about COVID for, you know, since the beginning. You know, some people were saying it's going to be over as early as April, right? And everybody will be back in church by Easter. Well, you know, that didn't quite pan out. So it's not exactly something that someone can predict, but I do think that we are going to ramp up production of the vaccine. It is going to be widely distributed. And at that point, it probably does not make sense to have a lot of these restrictions in place. You can probably justify loosening up on that.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Tom. Right on time. That was really great information. And if anyone has any questions, definitely Tom's email is right there. If you need to follow up with him directly, feel free. We are going to go to a break. So we will see you back here in 15 minutes. And Jackie will be hosting you guys the rest of the day.